This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. You know, the problem with our next guest is that he just doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, he's got no qualifications. I mean, sure, he's a New Yorker, which makes him endearing. Sure, he's an engineer. Sure, he's an inventor that holds patents on devices that I don't even understand how to operate. He's also a NASA astronaut and an author whose latest book has proven quite controversial. It's called Mission Out of Control, an astronaut's Odyssey to fix high-risk organizations and prevent tragedy. By now, you've probably realized I'm speaking ironically, and Dr. Charles Camarda does have an idea about things that are going on not only in the world of space exploration, science, and engineering, but problem solving in general. Very, very pleased to welcome back to the program Dr. Charles Camarda. Charlie, it's great to talk with you again.
Hey, thanks for having me again, Frank. Sorry we got cut off last time.
That's okay. I just chalk it up to alien interference, not liking some of the things that we were saying. It's all good. So for people that didn't hear our previous conversation, Charlie, your book deals with some of the problems at NASA, some of the mistakes, including mistakes that people have heard about, obviously, like the Challenger disaster, the Columbia disaster. You were the first space flight after the Columbia disaster, but also kind of near misses that maybe people didn't hear about because it wasn't on the front page. From what you can tell, has NASA today, in the year 2025, and I know you're not there anymore, but something tells me you're better informed about what's going on than most, has NASA today learned from its mistakes, or do they still have those sort of pitfalls in terms of leadership that might lead it to repeat mistakes in the future?
No, Frank, they have not learned their mistakes, and that's what's so troubling. You know, I wrote this book about how toxic the culture was because right after Challenger and Columbia, the cause of both of those accidents, according to the experts that analyzed these from a sociological behavioral science standpoint, they said the major cause of those accidents was the culture, the organizational culture. It was the prime cause of the accident, right up there with any of the technical causes of the accident. The problem is, most organizations find it very difficult to transform their toxic cultures. Boeing is going through this right now. And so a lot of what my book talks about is about NASA, Frank, but it really is about many, many industries. It could be aerospace, it could be the aircraft industry, Department of Defense, the medical industry. And when you look at organizations that have issues, the first thing you look at is the culture. Is it psychologically safe? And what you're seeing right now, and by psychologically safe, I mean people are allowed to speak up, speak freely, have open discourse and discussions, argue, and basically rely on the facts to basically prove right, whether or not they're right or wrong. But most importantly, their voices need to be heard. They cannot be canceled. And when people have a fear of doing this, they hold back. They see problems within an organization, but yet they're afraid to speak up. And you saw this both shuttle accidents, Challenger and Columbia. You also saw this at Boeing. And what's interesting, Frank, is, I give this presentation on the first half of the book that talks about all the ugliness of the things that happened that I was witnessed firsthand when I was at NASA even after the Columbia accident. I gave this presentation to Boeing executives on two different occasions, and on the last time I gave it, several people came up to me after I gave the presentation. Their eyes were like wide open. They couldn't believe that NASA was this bad, but they came up to me afterward and they said, you know what, Charlie, the culture is worse at Boeing. And I didn't believe them, Frank, but because I worked with the most amazing people at Boeing, I thought it was just a phenomenal company. And that was 6 months before the first Lion Air crash, the 737 MAX crash. And then 6 months later, you had the Ethiopian Airlines crash. And then the bottom fell out. And then everyone realized that Boeing had very similar issues that NASA had.
You know, one of the things that a lot of people that grew up in the 50s, 60s remember is the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And when the United States finally beat the Soviet Union to the moon in 1969, the thought was that the United States had won the space race. Now, if you look at America's greatest global adversary, or global competitor is maybe a better word, I think most people would say it's probably China. If you look at what China is doing with respect to space exploration and technology, it's astounding. 2 years ago, 2023, they launched over 200 spacecraft in 60 missions, achieving a flawless 100% launch success rate. They've completed a global navigation satellite network. They have done a Mars mission, successfully landing a rover on Mars. They've successfully collected all sorts of lunar samples from the far side of the moon, which was a historic first. Two-part question here, Charlie. Are we in a new space race with Mars? And if things continue along their current trajectory, are we in a new space race with China? And two, are we going to lose that space race to China if things continue as they are?
You know, Frank, and I'm going back to the last interview we had together. You asked these amazing questions, and it's almost as if I fed them to you, but I didn't. And this is exactly what I said when I retired from NASA, when NASA wasn't listening to anything I had to say about how we needed to transform our organization. The last thing I said to the administrator, then Steve Jerzik, we were at NASA headquarters, I said, you know, Steve, I worry about us going to the moon. I don't think NASA should be going to the moon because the state of NASA right now, if we had a space race with the Chinese going to the moon, we could lose. And so imagine if NASA loses, if the United States loses the next space race. You know, the outcome, look at what happened during Apollo. We'd have a reverse Apollo effect on our entire economy and what that would do to us, you know, educationally, financially. It would devastate us, and I really worry about that because the current state of NASA right now, you're watching us limp along with this Artemis program that has many, many problems, and we could talk about that, but it's taking us too long. It's costing us too much, and the strategy for getting there, what they call the architecture, the framework of how we plan to get there, is just has all these holes in it that we potentially could lose to the Chinese. And that's what I worry about.
If people are just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. We're talking with Dr. Charles Camarda. His book is Mission Out of Control, an Astronaut's Odyssey to Fix High-Risk Organizations and Prevent Tragedy. It was announced yesterday that Blue Origin's attempts, that's Jeff Bezos' company, to launch the New Glenn rocket, which is obviously named for John Glenn, is going to be delayed. Elon Musk is making all sorts of news with SpaceX on a regular basis. What do you see as the future of space travel and space exploration for America? Is it likely to be public, like NASA? Is it likely to be private with companies like Blue Origin? Or are we probably looking at some sort of combination?
I think it's going to be public, just like our aircraft industry. Our commercial aircraft industry is public. And I think it's a partnership also, because as I talk about in the book, the history of NASA started with NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And it was just three NACA centers. They were laboratories at Glenn Research Center in Ohio, Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia, and Ames Research Center in Moffett Field in California. And our role was applied research. We looked at advancing the state of the art and technology to make our aircraft industry the best, the leaders in the world. And we're at that point right now where Elon Musk has proven that you don't have to be NASA to launch humans to space. He's doing it all. He's even training his own astronauts. And so what you're seeing right now is the rise of commercial spacecraft companies and an industry, just like commercial aircraft industries, Lockheed, Boeing, you name it, McDonnell Douglas, right? And so you're going to have these space transportation systems built by commercial vendors, and they're going to have to seek out a market that enables them to be sustainable. And what I think NASA needs to return to is its applied research roots. And that's easier said than done. It's very difficult to do, but I think we're at the perfect time right now with the change in administration, and you have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy looking at DOGE and how do we transform these bureaucratic agencies that are a mess. And hopefully we can get it right and we can go back to our research roots, trim down the fat from NASA, and we work hand in hand with these Elon Musk, Sierra Nevada, you name it, Neutron, the Neutron rocket that's coming up with Rocket Lab and SpaceX. We work with these commercial companies to make them the best in the world.
You mentioned going to the moon. Obviously, the United States got there in 1969 and then did several other missions over the next 4 or 5 years. We haven't been back to the moon, at least with a manned mission, in over 50 years. A Japanese startup is set to launch a lunar lander this week. It's the second attempt to land on the moon after they failed for the first time in 2023. I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked others that are more intelligent than I am, but it's a question that regular people keep asking me because we like to discuss space and things on the show. What happened? Why was it seemingly so easy for us to get to the moon between 1969 and 1973? These lunar missions almost became routine. Seemed like we were going all the time, so much so that the public kind of got bored with them. And yet I've heard president after president, Bush, Obama, Trump, all talk about wanting to go back to the moon, and yet we haven't been able to do it. How are we farther back in terms of lunar exploration now than we were in 1969?
Well, that's another very good question, Frank, and I believe it's also talked about in my book, how NASA lost its mojo, right? And when we had these amazing applied research scientists, what I talk about is how that DNA was physically transferred from Langley, from Glenn, from Ames, to the space centers, to Johnson Space Center, to actually start the space age. We had these amazing people that had what I call a research culture. And we lost this research culture. We have good engineers, but we do not have good researchers. We don't have research engineers. And that was the purpose of these research centers. We lost contact with them the minute the Apollo program started to grow. Then you went into the space shuttle program, and the people at Johnson Space Center did not reach back out and work with the people at the research centers. We stopped giving funding to the research centers over 35 years ago, and we lost that capability. It was just by the grace of God that we still had some really talented people left, that after Columbia, we had to rely on those people to build the teams to understand what caused the problem and how to fix the problem. We do not have that capability right now. And so you watch us struggle to go back to the moon. And actually, you know, I raised this as a major issue before I left. I said there was a major culture problem. I went to speak to the administrator of NASA. I said, you know, I'm writing a book. It's about how bad the culture is. You really need to listen to this because we need to fix this problem. He basically pawned me off on two of his deputies, in headquarters. I gave them the synopsis of what my book was about, why we're broken and how to fix it. And they basically told me, Charlie, we don't believe you. And I said, okay. And I put my head down. I went back and I started finishing up my book. And then lo and behold, they had the Artemis mission. They had a capsule that first was unmanned and went around. It was EFT-1 using an Apollo-like heat shield. And that was way back in December of 2014. And they evaluated how that heat shield would do from low Earth orbit, right? Much less heating than it would experience if it came back from the moon. But we were trying to see if we could redevelop these technologies that we had during Apollo. And the heat shield is a very critical technology. And so it came back, it looked like it behaved well, and then NASA, in its infinite wisdom, said, you know what, we're going to change the design of that heat shield. Instead of filling 300,000 honeycomb cells with this goop of a material called Avcoat, which was an ablative material, we're just going to make it in blocks, and we're going to glue it on, and that's going to save us a lot of money, and we're going to be able to meet schedule. And then they had Artemis 1, an unmanned mission that went around the moon with this new heat shield design using a material from Apollo-like material. It came back, and it had major problems, but NASA tried to cover up the problems. And so the way I found out about it was I listened, and because I'm experienced and I researched culture and I lived in multiple different cultures at NASA, I could tell by what was being said in the press that there was a problem. The first things you heard was, it came back and the material charred or ablated differently, and it was different than our computer models, but there was plenty of margin and the crew would have survived. But when I went to look for pictures online to see what that heat shield looked like, there were no pictures online. And that caused my radar, my antenna to go up. And I said, NASA is up to its old tricks. It's downplaying the severity of the problem. They're not showing what's really wrong. And I started going back to headquarters and raising hell with people at headquarters at NASA. Spoke to chief engineers, spoke to deputies, associate administrators. And I said, we really need to put together a team as quick as possible. This is a big problem. And they really downplayed what I was saying, and they weren't doing anything about it until 17 months later. Then they tried to form an independent review team, but once again, they were up to their old tricks, and the teams weren't really independent. They were picking some of the same characters that made the same mistakes and the same bad decisions during Columbia and after Columbia, and they wouldn't look at alternate concepts. So right now, you heard the administrator and the deputy administrator on December 13th, 2024, basically tell the public that we're going to fly a crew around the moon using exactly the same heat shield design, where when they actually showed how bad the heat shield was, instead of it charred differently, it was slightly different, small pieces were coming off, large chunks of material were coming off in 100 different places on the bottom of the heat shield. It looked terrible. They were trying to cover it up. And they, in my mind, they're making exactly using the exact same behaviors, bad behaviors that caused Challenger and Columbia. We haven't learned our lesson.
That is really disappointing.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentix.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
Your snacking routine can get a little dull. Time for an Oikos remix. Like a crunchy storm of sea salt praline pretzels, dark chocolate, and butter toffee, showering down into a smooth, creamy yogurt. Enjoy 3 Oikos Remix varieties with epic mix-ins and 11 grams of complete protein per 4.5-ounce serving. See remixyogurt.com.
Talking about mistakes, talking about setbacks, there's been a lot of attention paid, deservedly so in my view, to these astronauts that thought they were going up for a 3-hour tour, and then all of a sudden they're still stranded at the International Space Station, sort of a science fiction 21st century Robinson Crusoe. We don't know when they're coming home. This date keeps getting pushed back and back and back. They seem in good spirits, and obviously they're well trained for this. They seem like they're handling it as well as can be, but it's still, to me, a tremendous black eye on someone. From your analysis of that situation, is that a failure of the culture and the leadership structure at NASA, at Boeing, at both, or something else entirely?
I think NASA has to own this as much as Boeing, okay? Because NASA engineers should have been looking at what Boeing was doing and looking at the testing they were doing on those thrusters and on the vehicle that they were actually designing. The NASA managers basically said it was okay to launch that vehicle when it had helium leaks. When it was, and so they launched that vehicle with a helium leak. The helium leak was still there. I think it was growing slightly. They were monitoring it when it was docked with the space station. But before they even docked with the space station, they had 7 thrusters that did not fire properly. These are thrusters that are very similar. They're called RCS, reaction control systems. They use hydrogen and nitrogen tetroxide to basically ignite. They don't need an igniter. They basically just touch the two systems together and they ignite. And so these RCS jets were very similar to the same RCS jets that we have on Space Shuttle. And some of the same problems with the valves were very similar to problems that we had seen in the past. And so NASA has a lot of experience with these systems, but they don't put the right teams together to understand what are the real root causes of why this is happening. Right. And so the testing that they did with those thrusters on the ground, they were not able to identify these issues. They did not simulate the actual environment well enough, and their analysis was not able to predict that they would have these failures, but they should have. And so what I'm saying is, just like NASA wasn't able to predict how the foam was coming off, the large pieces of foam, we saw this happening for the 30-some-odd years that we flew the space shuttle, but NASA was never able to predict what was causing that foam to come off. And so they had to live with these anomalies, and they had to create these workarounds, which in my mind really don't create, it's not safe to do that. It's not a safe way to operate, to just have workarounds. You have to understand the physics of the problem, which is what NASA is struggling to be able to do because they don't have the DNA anymore. They don't have that expertise anymore.
If you're just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. My guest is Dr. Charles Camarda. His book, Mission Out of Control, An Astronaut's Odyssey to Fix High-Risk Organizations and Prevent Tragedy, is about a lot more than just space travel or anything like that. It's about how we can kind of learn the lessons of NASA and other organizations to, solve whatever problems we're dealing with and not emulate some of those leadership mistakes that we've observed in NASA and kind of use those lessons in our own lives, whether it's personal, professional, etc. In that vein, Charlie, I am curious as to your take on this LA wildfire situation. There's been a lot of criticism of the leadership in California, but it's also difficult to know what's real and what's deserved criticism versus what's people trying to score political points. Have you had a chance to look at this wildfire situation in California, how it's been handled, and are you seeing any glaring leadership errors there?
Well, I just see what you see, Frank, on the news. And so I don't really have an insider's view as to what's going on. But it sure sounds like there's some leadership issues that are having issues, that are having problems. And so one of the first things I teach my students when we're solving these complex problems and you're coming up with these supposedly new solutions to these problems is you imagine the worst case scenario. You look at all the different ways the plan you have in place could potentially fail. And those are your weak points. And that's where you have to either have some sort of redundancy, like they talked about maybe electricity was going out, and so you didn't have pumps, and that was what was not causing the pressure, or the reservoirs were not filled. There were obviously holes in that system that made it so susceptible to go catastrophically wrong at the absolute worst time. And it behooves the leaders or the teams that they put together to understand this issue to really solve this problem in a better way. And I think you could use technology to help you do this. But what I talk about in my book is really how do you create these teams? And so what I do is, and I call them high-performing teams in the book, and I talk about what does that mean? What does a high-performing team look like? How do you link these teams together and make them work to solve these very complex problems? And complex problems are different than complicated problems because there are so many interfaces and interactions where small things could cause massive changes and disasters that you're never able to predict when and where an accident will happen, but you sure as heck see signs or weak signals that you have problems. And if you're tracking the system, and in the case of a fire, I'm talking about all the different components that make up how you would fight that fire, and if it happens, what the outcome would look like. You have to be able to identify weak signals where there are weak links and then dive in and understand, if you understand that that's a critical problem, and then put your resources on it to solve that problem, whether it's the pumps, whether it's the loss of water in the reservoirs. I mean, you have to be prepared.
Sure.
And it seems like California was not prepared.
Yeah.
And they should have been.
Final question, Charlie, and I do hope people check out the book, Mission Out of Control. In your experience, this is one of my favorite questions to ask people that have actually been to space. What is the most realistic movie depicting space travel, or what the most realistic movie that involved being an astronaut or anything like that?
Oh, geez. Oh, that is a real tough one. That is a real tough one. But if I could get away from movies for a minute, what impressed me very much was watching the Polaris Dawn mission that SpaceX did, and the new potential administrator for NASA, Jared Isaacman. What I saw there, if you watch closely and you listen to the whole 2-hour interview that they gave those astronauts that flew, what you saw was industry is ready to take on commercial human space flight. These astronauts trained for 2 years on that Polaris Dawn mission, and they invented new ways of training astronauts, and possibly better ways than NASA is training astronauts. They were working on advanced spacesuits. They were testing them in real time. They were conducting numerous experiments. I mean, I think that says it all, Jared. I think we're ready. We're ready to turn the page, hand human spaceflight over to industry, and NASA needs to play a partnership role looking at the next generation of technology in the far term.
All right, Charles Camarda, we're going to have to end it there. If people want to check out the book, they can go to your website, charliecamarda.com. That's CAMARDA.com. It's also available on Amazon or wherever books are available. Charlie, I always enjoy speaking with you very much. I hope we can do this again soon.
Anytime, Frank. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. If you want to comment on any portion of our discussion, you're welcome to give me a call at 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.